Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining today's Fisheries Interactions with Marine Renewable Energy Development webinar. Before we get started, we would like to mention for all of our guests joining that your phone lines are currently in a listen-only mode to minimize our background noise. We do a planned question and answer session at the end of our presentation today. However, you may submit note questions to us at any point throughout today's webinar by using the note chat function either on the right-hand side of your screen or located under the Participants menu at the top of your screen. Then please address all of these note questions to all presenters or all moderators located in the two drop-down box. If you do experience any technical issues throughout today's conference, we do ask that you submit these via the note chat as well directly to myself at ATT CES Operator. And with that, I'd like to end today's conference and hand the call over to Andrea Copping, Senior Marine Scientist, for our opening remarks and introductions. Andrea, please go ahead.
Thanks, Tony. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. This is Andrea Copping with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in the U.S., and I'm very pleased today to welcome you to this webinar sponsored by the Ocean Energy Systems Annex 4 group of member nations. Today's webinar represents an additional direction that Annex 4 is really focusing on, in addition to looking at environmental effects of marine renewable energy development. We are now really taking a stronger focus on social and economic risks and benefits of marine renewables. And I'm very pleased today to present this webinar that deals with one of the very key interactions that has both social and economic consequences, risks, benefits, etc., for marine renewable energy development, and that is fisheries interactions. Next slide, please. We've got two very experienced and honored presenters today, Mike Bell with Heriot-Watt University and Kieran Riley with University College Cork. Mike is going to present first, so if you'd like to go to the next slide, please. Mike is a research associate with the International Centre for Island Technology, or ICIT, at Heriot-Watt University in Orkney in the UK. He is a fishery scientist and marine biologist, and his research interests are in sustainable fisheries and their interactions with marine renewables. Previous research included working in a waterfowl conservation NGO and a government agency providing management advice and science in support of shellfish management. He's worked at ICIT at Heriot-Watt since 2008, and his research is focused on environmental and ecological consequences of wave and tidal energy development, together with an increasing focus on the inshore fisheries sustainability. So, Mike, if you'd like to go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. I'll just switch over to sharing my screen now. So hopefully this will appear on your screens anytime now. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Good evening, wherever you are. And it's good afternoon here from Orkney, where I'm speaking to you from Heriot-Watt University's Stromness campus. So this topic is of particular interest to us here in Orkney. That's the topic of potential interactions between marine renewables and fisheries. We have the development of a new wave and tidal energy industry emerging here, right alongside traditional inshore fisheries that targeted fish and particularly shellfish in these waters for many years, centuries even. And there's a drive towards sustainable management of inshore fisheries that's happening right now, and that's happening right alongside the exploration of how these might cohabit with a new industry. So, I'm concentrating here mainly on wave and tidal energy. And here the emphasis is on potential rather than actual interactions. And I'll be using the word potential rather a lot, I think, during this presentation. So there's not really enough metal in the water, certainly at commercial scales, to provide a real account of the actual interactions as yet. I'll also be taking a very high-level overview of this topic. So starting with identifying where the two industries are likely to come into contact with one another, bearing in mind that that might actually include all their areas of influence. They're essential habitat, if you like. Then it's obvious to ask, what happens if they do come into contact in this way? Well, it has both ecological and human dimensions. And it's also relevant to consider whether all the potential interactions are necessarily negative. Are there actually potential opportunities as well as impacts here? Then finally, I'm going to go on to just show a little bit of data on the inshore fishing fleet in Orkney and how that it distributes itself in relation to areas that are leased for wave and tidal energy developments. So, what about those overlaps? Well, first point to note really is that neither energy nor fishery resources are homogeneously or even randomly distributed. They occur in particular places. So these graphs show cumulative curves for the UK. So on the left we have energy resources, wave and tidal power. On the right we have fishery value. So the upper graphs have to do with all areas of the UK waters, and then just inshore waters on the bottom row. And these graphs fairly clearly show that concentration. So the more these curves bulge to the left, that shows the more they're concentrated in particular places. So thus, for example, the best tidal resources are highly concentrated. Particularly pelagic fisheries, the value that they deliver is highly concentrated in particular places. But all of these things are not completely evenly distributed through marine space. So, are these the same places is the next question to ask. Well, the graphs on this page show cumulative landings value against the cumulative energy resource. So on the y-axis of here we've got all the either tidal or wave power starting with the highest resources and laid end to end until we've got to all of the resources. How does fisheries value actually distribute in relation to that? Well, in general, you can see that the energy resources are not the same areas that are delivering fisheries value. And although there's some quite interesting patterns here, I'm not intending to explore these, but it's our attention really to the bottom left-hand corner of all of these curves, which is showing that where the highest resources are is not where the highest fishery value is. So here are the figures for the percentage of fisheries value in the UK for selected species that coincides with the top 10% of the energy resource in this accessible inshore zone. So setting aside this apparent overlap for pelagic fisheries and wave energy resource, that's just it's not an artifact, it's real data, but it's very much dominated by particular value for blue whiting off the Western Isles, off the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, which skews the figure quite a lot. But overall, we see these values are relatively low. Well, so far, so reassuring. At a national scale, whilst it's not true to say that no area of interest to a wave or tidal developer does not also deliver significant fisheries value, the overlap does appear to be small. That, however, is to set aside a couple of issues. That's the issue of wider areas of influence, which I mentioned earlier, which are not really considered here. But just as significant, it also sets aside the fact that national significance is not necessarily a good guide to regional significance, and particularly to importance to local communities. And these may be quite fragile, particularly in remote coastal areas. So I would argue that it's local fisheries on small inshore stocks to which we should particularly address our attention. For reasons that I'll touch on later, this might particularly apply to low mobility stocks, most obviously shellfish. It also underlines the need for more detailed information on the fine-scale distribution of fishing efforts, and that's particularly lacking for small vessels which are pursuing these local scale inshore fisheries. Now let's move on to consider what the nature of any interactions might be. Well, it's convenient to group effects of marine renewables under these four headings. So we have changes in physical processes that might affect ecological processes. We have operational effects. We have provision of new or at least changed habitat space. We also have displacement of other human activities, by which we, of course, in this context mean fisheries. Well, I'm going to highlight just a few of those here. A lot of attention has been paid to the second on this list for very obvious reasons, and rightly so, those operational effects. But I'm going to focus my attention elsewhere. There's quite a lot being said about some of those things. So firstly, I'm going to look at energy as an ecological factor. Now, if it's an ecological factor, it's fairly obvious that interception and redirection of that energy has the potential for ecological consequences. Those are likely to extend into the far field, as is fairly clearly indicated by a variety, particularly tidal models. And it's also fair to say that at the broad scale, it's the scale rather than the method of energy extraction. So how much energy rather than how you extract that energy, which is of most importance. I'll also mention some of the opportunities that may arise in relation to ecological space and in relation to displacement of fishing. But first, let's go to the topic at the top of that list, that's energy extraction impinging on natural processes. Here's an example relating to energy as an ecological factor based on some work being undertaken for the EcoWatt 2050 project. So these maps show models for the distribution of nephrops habitat. Well, actually, it's an OSPAR priority marine habitat, sea pens and burrowing megafauna, but that is a very close representation of the environment that supports nephrops and supports nephrops fisheries. So these maps are based on current hydrodynamic conditions and those with large-scale tidal energy extraction. So underlying that, there's Marine Scotland's Scottish Shelf model and physical scenarios modelled by Judith Wolfe and her colleagues at the National Oceanography Centre. So I'll use those as data layers in species distribution models. So in these two maps, the green colours show the areas where you're most likely to get this particular habitat. That is a very good match, actually, for the distribution of nephrops fisheries in these UK and Irish waters. So spot the difference, you might say. Those two maps do look very similar. Let me add in a third map, which is the one subtracted from the other. And you can see that there are, in fact, some differences, even if they're somewhat subtle. So the dark green areas show those areas where we might expect to get gain. So in the southern region of the flooding ground, for example, there are also some areas where we might see losses, so perhaps in the more central areas of the flooding ground. Those losses are not enormous. It's also worth saying that changes due to climate change may very well be larger than this, which is not to say that the contribution owing to energy extraction can then be ignored. Well, this is just one example. The EcoWatt 2050 project is going on to look at this for a much wider range of species and habitats, and results of that will hopefully be out relatively shortly. So there is ongoing modelling that's going to shed light on this. But given the outcome of such modelling exercises, it will be relevant to ask, what are the limits of acceptable change? Well, I'm not going to offer an answer to that question. That's at least partly a policy issue. But I will just note that providing metrics of change certainly is a scientific issue. And clearly these should address both overall change in habitat availability and the scale of any spatial shift in relation to the ability of species to respond to it. And work on these metrics and how they might be represented is very much under development. But climate change I've already mentioned as an essential backdrop to this. I should also mention the scope for a lot more attention to be paid to effects of energy extraction on ecological connectivity, breakages of which can have significant consequences at the population scale. In other consequences, particularly as a result of climate change, we can see just that happening. And if we get tidal energy, for example, disrupting large-scale circulation patterns, very clearly there is scope to change these kinds of ecological connectivity involved in transport of propagules and delivery to suitable grounds for that settlement. But for now, I'll move on to look at these opportunities I was mentioning earlier. So I have a couple of slides in which I'll briefly consider some potential positive aspects of interactions. So one of these is the opportunity for habitat enhancement, either deliberate or just incidental with the introduction of new structure into the marine environment. Well, in our area, in the Orkney waters and the Penton Firth, we have Orkney Sustainable Fisheries, which is currently working with the university here to determine whether structures associated with particularly wave, but also tidal developments, such as gabions and other mooring structures, whether they might be of value in providing new habitat for juvenile crustaceans, that's particularly juvenile lobsters. So there's aquarium studies that have recently been undertaken where Matthew Coleman has shown that hatchery-reared juvenile lobsters will very readily use aggregates as habitat, the sorts of aggregates that might very well be used in gabions. But as they develop, the lobsters do match their size to the grade as they grow. Field trials using proper large gabions will follow in due course. Well, there's a long way to go to demonstrate real benefit, but depending on where there are bottlenecks in the particular life histories of the species such as lobster, there does seem some scope for real benefit here, and it's certainly worth exploring in the future. That's not the only kind of opportunity. Let me highlight another one to a much larger spatial scale, which has received some attention. At this large spatial scale, it's relevant to consider what are the consequences of fisheries being excluded from development areas, particularly in terms of the relationship between the stock and its fishery. Well, based on simple spatial models, we can identify a few of the ways in which closed areas are likely to affect this relationship. And none of these things are surprising, so larger closed areas have more influence. Closed area effects are more effective on species which are more likely to remain inside them, so on low mobility species. Habitat value within the closed area matters, as does the behavior of the target species, particularly towards structures and new habitat within those closed areas. And these outcomes can be seen in terms of both conservation of spawning stocks, and here the likely effects are overwhelmingly positive, but also on the level of catch, yield, which can be taken by a fishery. Those outcomes can go in both directions. Well, to demonstrate that, I'll just gallop through some results, a very simple fishery model into which we can introduce some spatial structure. So here's an example that's been done using biological parameters relevant to Orkney lobsters. And many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with these kind of per-recruit curves. What those do is simply show how relative spawning potential, here on the left, and fishery yield, here on the right, will be expected to respond to changes in fishing efforts. So if we expect our fishery to be located about 1 on these curves, this shows what happens if you either increase or decrease fishing effort. Well, we can very easily start putting values on those curves. Particular points on those curves can be used as criteria for fishery management. For example, aiming to protect a particular portion of spawning output or to maximise yield. Well, what happens if we start introducing some closed areas into this? Well, in this example, not a lot actually. So in this area where we've got even quite a substantial area of the fishery closed and quite a modest exchange of individuals between open and closed areas, there's very little effect on either the curves themselves or management criteria. Increase the habitat value within the closed area, i.e. introduce a kind of reef effect. The curves and the criteria change, and in general they're showing increased resilience to fishing pressure. So the reference points move to the right, and the curves tend, at least at the right-hand end, they tend to be above the curves for the open fishery. And in this case, this is done without much cost in terms of loss to yield, except for lower values of fishing effort. That's not necessarily true of all scenarios that we might look at. There's scope, but not time to look at a lot of those. So just finish that section to say that this does just illustrate some of the possibilities in relation to opportunities for developments to contribute to spatial fishery management. In practice, there really are many uncertainties, and it's going to be really important to monitor the outcomes of real developments. And going beyond theoretical considerations, we should be aware of a big but. Given territoriality and other spatial constraints, fishing effort may not be as free to redistribute as is assumed in simple models such as these. However, the human factor is a crucial determinant of outcomes. Okay, heading for a close here, our last couple of slides, I'll just show some data relating to the distribution of fishing effort by vessels fishing for crab and lobster in Orkney waters, either using creels, a kind of baited trap. So this work was funded by the Crown Estate with sucker fish VMS systems sponsored by Marine Scotland. Really, I'm just going to show you these data, not provide any particular analysis. I'll just say that it does provide a real resource for both developers and fishermen for demonstrating value and for avoiding conflict. And overlaying on this map, so the red areas are the areas most used by fishermen, the yellow areas somewhat less. You can see the purple outlines are the tidal sites, and the green outlines are the wave leasing sites. So you get a good idea of the relationship. Here, it's just a close-up for the EMET wave and tidal energy test sites at Billier, Crewe and Falls of Warness, respectively. Well, we need a lot more such data, and we need to explore such data and to understand the processes involved. But ongoing, these are going to be an immensely valuable resource for basing planning decisions and for fishermen to use in evidence to demonstrate how grounds are delivering value for them. So finally, a few concluding remarks. In my view, spatial is probably the most important keyword relating to the potential for interactions between fisheries and marine renewables. For wave and tidal energy, at least, inshore fisheries important to local communities are the most important to consider, especially for low mobility species. And there are opportunities as well as impacts to be noted here, but crucial to understand how fishing effort will respond to displacement from development areas. Far-field effects of energy extraction on target species need further examination, and I highlight connectivity as a potentially important issue here. And finally, as always, following a deploy and monitor policy, effective monitoring must happen if we are to learn for real. So that's it. It just remains for me to say thank you to everyone involved in Annex 4 for giving me the opportunity to speak here. And I'll hand back to Andrea to move along to the next section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was really great. A lot of information packed in there, some real food for thought. Okay, up next is Kieran Riley, and he's just going to get his slides up. He'll be talking about attitudes and perceptions of fishermen on the island of Ireland towards marine renewable energy development. Kieran received a Master's in Economic and Environmental Modeling in 2011 from the National University of Ireland in Galway. In 2016, he finished his PhD thesis, The Socio-economic Interactions of Marine Renewable Energy Development and the Commercial Fishing Industry in Ireland. And he's at the Marine and Renewable Energy Centre at the University of College Cork. He's been since working on community ownership of wind renewable energy projects for Ireland. So, Kieran, whenever you're set and get your slides up, you can go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. I'm just waiting for the slides to come up here. I'll just be, I think, just a couple of seconds.
And Kieran, this is Tony, your moderator. I did pass you over the presenting rights here, so you should be able to go into that sharing and go to the screen share option.
Okay, thanks. Is that okay?
Wonderful. We have the slides coming through now.
Got it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Just like to thank Andrea and everyone at the Annex 4 for inviting me along to do this webinar, and thanks to Mike for a very interesting presentation there. So basically, I think this hopefully this presentation will complement some of Mike's work, and hopefully I won't repeat anything that he said. So this is the title is The Attitudes and Perceptions of Fishermen on the Island of Ireland Towards Marine Renewable Energy Development, and it involves 3 case studies that look into the attitudes and perceptions of fishermen towards marine renewables. So I'll just run through quickly what the outline. Oh yeah, so just I'll go through a quick introduction. I'll talk a little bit about the case study sites, and then I'll go into the methodology used to collect the information, and then just run through the results and then some key conclusions and recommendations. So just to start off then, for the sake of this presentation, marine renewable energy refers to offshore wind and wave and tidal energy. So the expansion of the MRE sector will inevitably have some effect on traditional users of the sea, and commercial fishermen are arguably the group that are most likely to be affected by the development of marine renewables. So in terms of the expected effects, they are to a large extent undocumented and unknown, but there will be impacts and opportunities for fishermen, and then there's a significant potential for spatial conflict. So with this in mind, then the aim of the study, or the aim of my PhD, was to assist in forming the basis then for the long-term coexistence of the nascent MRE sector and the well-established commercial fishing sector in Ireland. So from this, there were three main objectives for the study. And the first was to gather information on the attitudes of Irish fishermen towards the development of marine renewable energy in their locality. Secondly, to identify the perceived impacts and opportunities associated with marine renewables. And then thirdly, to identify any potential mitigation measures that were suggested by the fishermen who took part in the study. So there were 3 case study sites that were chosen for the project. I'll start over on the left-hand side of the screen, just along the west coast of Ireland. So it's the first one is the Atlantic Marine Energy Test Site. So the AMEX is under development by the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, and its purpose then is to test and to demonstrate the performance of wave energy converters in generating electricity, and then to test the survivability of wave energy converters in open ocean conditions. So there are 2 test sites at this area, one for testing devices at 50 meters water depth, and the other for testing devices then at 100 meter water depth. So fishing in this area is mainly based on brown crab and lobster. So there's limited trawling that's done in the area because it's quite it's inshore, and there's a presence of large boulders in the area. So it's mainly smaller vessels that are under 15 meters that are fishing for crab and lobster. Then moving on to the next test site. So at the top of the diagram there's two projects. These two projects were treated as one case study site because of the proximity to each other. But they're two tidal energy projects, and it's 100 megawatt tidal arrays that are being developed of the north coast of Antrim in Northern Ireland, at Tor Head and then Fair Head respectively. So construction on both projects was expected to begin in 2017, and I think it's still on course. And again, in this area, the fishing is limited to, there's a small number of quite small vessels, again, most under 15 meters that fish for crab and lobster. So thirdly then, just the circle on the right-hand side of the diagram is the First Flight Wind project. So the First Flight Wind project was originally intended to be a 600 megawatt offshore wind project off the coast of County Down, also in Northern Ireland. So in June of 2014, the target capacity of the project was reduced to between 300 and 400 megawatts due to considerable fishing and shipping activity that is carried out in the area. So after that, then in November of the same year, 2014, the project was subsequently cancelled then due to the fact that it wouldn't be finished in time to avail of the UK renewable energy market incentives. So fishing in this area, it should be noted that the three main fishing ports in Northern Ireland are located along the coast of County Down, which is just where the project is being developed. So these are Kilkeel, Ardglass and Portavogie. And the majority then of the fishing activity is directed towards nephrops or prawns. So they're quite large vessels, trawling vessels, but there's also a considerable number of smaller vessels that are also fishing for crab and lobster again. So to carry out the study, a mixed methodology approach was used to gather both quantitative and qualitative data from fishermen at the sites. For the quantitative research, a questionnaire survey was designed to gather the information, and this study was based on a survey of fishermen from the west coast of Scotland who were asked on their attitudes and perceptions towards marine renewable energy, and it attempted to build on this study by choosing the three case study sites where projects are actually were actually being developed. Then for the qualitative research, a semi-structured interview approach was chosen, and then so fishermen who indicated their willingness to take part in the interview during the survey were used for the interview. So then just to move on, so during the survey, respondents read the statement, I think that it is important to develop marine renewable energy sources in my locality, and they were asked to rank their agreement on a 5-point Likert scale ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So for the sake of clarity in the graph here, these are being aggregated to agree, neutral and disagree. So across the three sites, 40% of those who took part in the survey agreed with the statement. While the highest level of agreement, as it can be seen, was at the AMET site in Balmullis, and the lowest level of agreement was at the First Flight Wind project. I suppose I'll talk a bit more about that later on. So respondents then were asked a follow-on question from that, then whether they thought that so can fishing and marine renewable energy coexist. So overall, again, 70% thought that marine renewable energy and fishing can coexist, and again at each of the sites it follows a similar pattern to the attitudes. So 90%, the majority of those surveyed at the AMET site felt that fishing and marine renewables could coexist, while at the First Flight Wind site then there was the least amount that felt that both sectors could coexist. So basically, yeah, once these results were compared to the Scottish study, it was concluded that the attitudes are following, or may be following, a U-shaped curve. So following a review of the literature, hypothesized that attitudes towards onshore renewable energy developments follow a U-shaped curve. So in this curve, attitudes range from positive, so this is when people are not aware of a renewable energy project in their locality, to much more critical when a project is announced, and then it returns to a positive attitude again, which usually happens some reasonable time after the construction. So yeah, as I said, when these are compared, when the results from the Irish study are compared with the Scottish study, it would seem that the attitudes are following this U-shaped curve, in that the majority of the fishermen, the Scottish fishermen, were unaware of any marine renewable energy development, and their attitudes were more positive than the Irish fishermen, and all of the Irish fishermen surveyed were aware of the projects in their locality. Then just to move on to the perception of opportunities. So respondents were asked an open-ended question then on the potential opportunities for marine renewable energy for fishermen. And this question was, what do you think are the potential opportunities or benefits that marine renewable energy might provide for the fishing industry? So as you can see here, the most cited opportunity was alternative employment, with 58 people mentioning that. And this is followed by the creation of marine habitat, or the artificial reef effect, which Mike mentioned in his presentation, and then followed by a smaller number who mentioned the potential for harbour infrastructure improvements that might be associated with the development of marine renewable energy. So despite this, there's actually evidence that the first flight wind project of fishing vessels in the area being used for work on marine renewable energy projects, and this is acknowledged by a number of the fishermen, and the potential for employment. And the sort of employment that exists currently is guard vessels, survey vessels, and fisheries liaison work. So on the first flight wind project, a vessel from Kilkeel was used for the environmental impact assessment for survey work on that, and a services company was set up by one of the fishing industries, the fish producers organisations in Ireland, to provide services to mainly to the offshore wind energy sector. But despite this, there was uncertainty from the qualitative interviews. It arose that there was a number of uncertainties over whether fishermen would be sufficiently qualified to avail of the alternative employment, or whether their vessels would meet the standards then required to carry out work on marine renewable energy projects. And I'll just go through a quote here from one of the fishermen, and this is from a Nephrops trawl fisherman on the first flight wind project, which sort of sums this up. So I'll just read through this quickly. So the quote is, on a very short-term basis, there will probably be guardship opportunities for, 2, 3, 4 boats, to these 3 or 4 individuals who would get a guardship job, which would last for the duration of the construction. That would be some benefit to them during that period. Thereafter, there's the servicing of those, which is done by specialist vessels, so it wouldn't be us servicing them. It would be a firm that has wind caps that would be coming in. And fair enough, you might sell a bit of fuel locally to those wind caps, and maybe the hotel up the road might put up the engineers to service them, so there would be some small benefit to the local community, but it would be far outweighed by the damage done to the fishing industry. So there, the perception is that from that obviously the potential for alternative employment wouldn't be sufficient enough to outweigh the potential damages that could be done to fishing in the area. So in terms of impacts, again, the fishermen surveyed were asked an open-ended question on what they thought the potential impacts of marine renewable energy could be for fishermen. But by far the largest potential impact would be loss of access to fishing ground taken up by marine renewable energy projects. This will be followed by impact on fish species, and obstruction or navigation hazard, and then the displacement of fishermen, which again is related to the loss of access to fishing ground. So in terms of the interviews that I did, this is the quote here that sort of that sums up this again. So this is a separate Nephrops trawl vessel owner on the first flight wind project, and so his attitude towards the impacts were that it's going to obstruct our fishing operations. And I'd be very cynical that we would get anything, or if there would be a spin-off into the local communication or the local communities, or any benefit at all. In fact, if the harbour facilities on our 3 fishing ports were going to be used in any degree at all by the offshore wind people, it would deny us harbour space. So again, there's another potential impact. So in terms of the mitigation, again, this is another open-ended question where respondents were asked in the survey to suggest any potential mitigation options that would help. And by mitigation, then, it was defined as any options or strategies that would help to either enhance the potential opportunities or to limit the negative impacts on fishermen. And yeah, as you can see from this slide, then consultation was the highest or the most often mentioned mitigation option, followed by locating in areas not used for fishing, and then followed by compensation. So just to expand on this and on the approach, just to sum up in terms of not locating on prime fishing grounds. So if they, and that's the planning authorities, were to sit down with fishermen's representatives at a very early stage, at a stage before a particular piece of ground is put out to tender, so that when it is put out for tender, the objections are minimised at an early date rather than put it in for tender. And now they've been successful, they have to fight every stakeholder there for every inch of the ground. That's not a very sensible way of going about business. So again, the suggestion here is that if I suppose the fishermen had been consulted or spoken to maybe earlier in the project about their fishing grounds, or that they might have been able to reach a consensus in terms of a location that would have a minimal impact on fishing, but also be able to satisfy the requirements of the wind energy developer. So just then, I suppose that's just to run through the key conclusions. So in terms of the attitude, or the attitudes towards the projects, I think further research in this area is required then on whether the attitudes of fishermen change as projects advance, and whether there's an increased level of acceptance towards them. So this would be in terms of, so to see if it follows Vaulting's U-shaped curve, basically, as the projects become more developed and they're more established, and the fishing community have a chance to get used to the projects. So in terms of the potential benefits, alternative employment will help to retain the benefits locally, and local hire and training programs would help to reduce the uncertainty, I suppose, the fishermen have over whether they would have the necessary skills or the to obtain work on marine renewable energy projects, and then also in terms of the vessels, whether the vessels would be fit for purpose. And then the preferential hiring of displaced fishermen could be adopted by marine renewable energy developers, whereby like fishermen who are most likely impacted by the developments would be given preferential hiring then on the projects. And also, just in terms of that, the services company model that's used by fish producer organisations to provide services for the onshore or the offshore wind energy sector, it would be useful. It's a useful model basically that allows fishermen to obtain work on the projects. But there is still perception out there among the fishermen that there may not be jobs for them on their projects, and I think if developers are on a promising projects or promising jobs on the projects, it may do more harm to the perception towards the developer than good if the jobs then fail to materialise. So in terms of then the potential mitigation, the impacts. So as you said, the largest impact was the impact on fishing grounds. So that currently data deficiencies are a key barrier then to site selection, especially for smaller vessels where there isn't any vessel monitoring system data available. I know that this is improving, but there's still limited information there. And I know Mike mentioned the use of suckerfish, which is becoming more common, and which will help to fill in these gaps. But also early engagement then with fishermen in these in areas where projects are being developed will help to fill gaps in the baseline data. And exercises such as mapping, the mapping of fishing activity can also enable the participation of fishermen, so to move it on a further consultation then provided that the information is used before sites are selected for development. And this could help this could lead to a collaborative siting process and could also help to inform maritime spatial planning. So that's pretty much it from me. And just again, I'd like to thank Andrea and all the Annex 4 team, and also to Mike then for his presentation.
Karen, thank you very much. Very interesting. Makes you feel a little despondent for the fishermen, I have to say.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. So we have a number of questions here for both Mike and Karen. I'm going to start with this one from Mike. Many capture fisheries range over large areas to catch fish. How can we determine what spatial scales we need to focus on to determine likely interactions with marine renewables? And also, don't we have to focus on the time scale, the seasonal or annual sort of patterns, I guess, over which fishers catch fish? So spatial and temporal scale, I guess.
Yeah. If I answer the first part of that question first, I think primarily this relates to the mobility of the target species. I think the nature of kind of spatial interactions, provided that they're actually moving in and out of areas from which the fishery is excluded, there is some degree of access of the fishery to all of the members of that stock. So what determines the real relationship of fishing with that stock is primarily the rate at which it moves across the grounds. And also, which is a big unanswered question, I think, for a lot of fisheries, is quite closely related with the structure of stocks. Now, very often, although we consider a stock, we give a stock a name and we draw a line around that stock, that's not always the same as being certain of the biological identity of that stock and the sort of meta-population structure which might be involved there. And I think it is quite crucial to understand that to be able to get some idea of the biological nature of the interaction between the fishery and the stock and how that is modified by exclusion of fishing from particular grounds. Moving to the second part of the question, which related to temporal patterns, I think, the seasonality. My view is that's probably slightly somewhat less important, given that we're not talking about the spatio-temporal management per se here, given that a renewable energy development is where it is, and it's there through the year. Therefore, fishing is excluded at any time of year, no matter what the seasonality in the actual behaviour of the organism or in the fishery itself. So I think, if I'm understanding the question right, there is rather less scope for exclusion or interactions to modify the nature of that particular interaction. Does that go some way to answering the question?
Yeah, I think that was great. Super. Okay, I have a question here for a very specific question for Karen. One of the participants noted that the AMET's results for the fishermen's perceptions were interesting and wondered if the fishermen answering the questions understood that AMET's or believed that AMET's is, being a test center is likely to remain a test center and not have any sort of large-scale commercial development. And could that have sort of colored their perceptions?
Yeah, thanks for that. That was mentioned in one of the interviews that it was very clear from the beginning that so the SEAI put in a considerable effort into the Sustainable Energy Authority or developing AMS site, put in a considerable effort into ensuring that fishermen were fully informed about the project, and they gave them every opportunity to participate then in decision making on that project. But it was always made clear that it was would be a test site and that there wouldn't be any commercial activity in the area. and that was mentioned by one of the fishermen that I interviewed at the site, that if there was to be any commercial activity in the area, then it may be a different story. But just also on that as well, I suppose the fact that the site and the spatial scale of the site at AMH, the two sites are quite small relative to the fishing grounds in the area, and also I think maybe, as I said before, because the SAI put in such a considerable effort into ensuring that the stakeholder consultation was done to the highest possible standard. I think that helped to improve the attitudes of the fishermen towards that. And in fact, one of the test sites was reconfigured in consultation with the fishermen in order to reduce the impact on their fishing ground.
Great, thank you. Okay, another question from Mike here, comment and a question. First of all, great introduction to this issue. How can we take this experience in the UK and transfer to other nations, both for inshore fisheries and also open ocean fisheries?
Interesting question. If this underlines the need for anything, it is the need for data. And for me, primarily, that is data on where fishing is occurring. Now, in the European waters, we have very good information for larger vessels. My contention is that for the more important vessels, and certainly for wave and tidal, not necessarily for wind, but more important vessels for wave and tidal are smaller vessels, and we have very little information. We're starting to have more, and we're starting to have more dynamic information. And I think that need for information on real fishing, where real fishing is happening and where it's really delivering value, is absolutely crucial at all spatial scales, including the open ocean. Now, the kinds of interactions that I've been talking about, particularly the spatial interactions, are very scale dependent, I think, and they're also very dependent on little factors, I think, like how potential developments are distributed in space. So it's not just a matter of how much is closed, but how that area is distributed across the ground. And I think that might very well differ between inshore and offshore areas and open ocean areas, where I'm guessing that much larger tracts might be closed off. And I think we need to very much understand the spatial scales at which that's happening in relation to the spatial scales for both the biological stocks and the fisheries that are targeting them. So that's a bit of a rambly way, I think, just to say data is the key, and data on where fishing happens, I think, is the key.
Great, thank you. So Karen, here's a question for you. Did you see any correlation with the sort of optimism or cynicism of the fishermen that you interviewed with the type of fisheries that they are employed in?
Yeah, that's another good question. I suppose obviously that they are quite different, but in general, let me think. At the first flight wind project, there was a lot of negativity by both vessels, or by both static gear vessels and mobile gear vessels. So there wasn't much difference there. And the other two sites, there was no mobile gear that were there. But yeah, again, it would be interesting to look at that to see whether the gear type used would affect their attitude towards it.
Thank you. So we have a question here that I think is really for both of you, and you might want to both think about this. Do we have adequate methods or frameworks for gathering and interpreting information on potential conflicts between fisheries and marine renewables? And Mike has already mentioned that data is really key to it. What about other methods and especially how we interpret these data? Either one, if you want to go first.
I'll give way to Kieran on that one. That seems very clear to relate to his experience in gaining information from fishermen, I would guess, Kieran.
So in terms of like the consultation process is one option that's there. It's a good way to gather information. I think, as Mike said, then suckerfish data and then the mapping. I know there have been studies done for like ScotMap, for example, that has mapped fishing activity for smaller vessels where there is no information, like no VMS data available. So basically, fishermen, from what I understand, were literally asked to point out on a map the areas where they fish. And I suppose when there's no other information available, something like that, it can be quite helpful, I think, and it can help to give an indication where the smaller vessels in particular will fish. But definitely VMS data there is there for vessels over 12 metres, and it can be analysed then to give you like the sort of the spatial activity of fishing vessels.
I could add to that to sort of broaden that out to a quite wide range of areas where we need monitoring information. As I pointed out a number of times during my presentation, there are a lot of predictions that we can make, and there's a lot of models that we can make. What we really need to do is have verified observations. So if we're expecting that a fishery might respond in a particular way, let's make sure that we collect the fishery statistics on catch and effort, on where it happens, and on the composition of catch to really understand if that really is what happens. I guess that's the job of stock assessment, which needs to be integrated with a sort of wider monitoring of the marine environment. But also, I think we need to verify the kind of predictions that we're making in terms of changes in the physical environment and whether that has the consequences, for example, for habitat, for essential habitat for fish and shellfish species. Does that have the consequences we expect? So I think as well as capturing information very close to the fishery, we need to take the broadest view of what is happening in the marine environment.
Great. Okay. Let's see. Another question for Kieran. Do you think there are opportunities for the marine renewable industry, maybe other stakeholders, to reach out to fishermen to change some of the perceptions of sort of the somewhat bleak outcome that they see? And I know that you did offer a number of suggestions about consultation and so on and so forth, but what do you see those opportunities really are, and is it the industry that ought to be doing that?
It's a good question. I suppose in terms of the opportunities that are there, maybe they could be highlighted, like as Mike mentioned, the work that's going on up in the Orkneys in terms of whether there could be like a new marine habitat created by a marine renewable energy project. So I suppose that sort of work needs to continue ongoing, and the results need to be given to the fishermen. I think they need to know obviously whether there is the opportunity for that, and whether there are longer term benefits for them. So and the question of whether that's the developers' role to do that. I think definitely they have some role in providing that information to fishermen along with research. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're all sort of struggling with how we do this.
Yeah, it's hard sort of to, obviously you don't want to have like, it's difficult for developers in particular, like wave energy developers, like to get these projects up and running anyway. So like it's maybe it's not their responsibility to have like extra work. There could be some sort of assistance there by the government.
Great. Okay, I have one more question here. I guess for each of you, can you think of examples from the UK, from Ireland, or elsewhere where developers have offered benefits to the local community. Maybe it could be training programs or improvements to the harbors and ports, so on, where this resulted in fishermen changing their stance or their attitude a little bit towards the projects.
So I could offer one experience here, which is very much not related to particular development, but more the emergence of the industry. I think it's fair to say that when the wave and tidal energy leasing areas were announced for Orkney and the Pentland Firth areas, that came as somewhat of a surprise to a lot of the fishermen. Now, a lot of good work has been done since then particularly by the Crown Estate in terms of actually properly engaging with the fishing industry and initiating particularly this project of getting information on what areas of the fishery are delivering value. Now, I think we've seen in Orkney waters, I don't say there's been any kind of real epiphany necessarily, but we see people who have been or are involved in the fishing industry very much more engaged with renewables, whether it's simply as part of the marine user community or more specifically through employment of guard vessels and other things, and even transferring into the support industry and supply chain for marine renewables. I can't think of an example that's specific to particular developments. We've certainly seen a change in the nature of that interaction in the waters over recent years. So maybe that partially covers that.
Great. Kieran, any thoughts as the Irish government or SEAI has started to put effort into the industry?
I suppose just, well, the one example I could give, I suppose, from the case studies, again, is the First Flight Wind project. Again, I suppose it's Northern Ireland, so it's the UK, but there was one of the fish producers organisations in Northern Ireland. There's two main ones, and one of them set up a services company then specifically to provide services to the project, to the offshore wind energy sector as well. And I think the fact that there were jobs for fishermen on that project, it did help somewhat to help change their attitude towards it. But also, just I suppose I give a quick example of the Tannish Fishermen's Association in the UK that set up a fuel company to supply fuel for, I think it's the London Array. And to supply fuel to the service vessels that are carrying out work on or that were carrying out work on the project and maintenance work. And I think that's been a very successful mitigation option by the developer there, and it's helped, I think, increase the acceptance of the project among fishermen. But yeah,
Great.
It's a Fishermen's Association fuel company. I think people want to look it up.
Great. So early consultation and make sure there's some employment.
Yeah, I think so.
That's what's going to help. Okay. Well, I think we're done. I don't see any other questions, so I think that's great, and we'll wrap up here. If you want to just go to that last slide, please, Tony. I want to thank everybody for joining us here today, and I think this is such an important issue. We may a little later have a webinar taking in some other nations as well, because this is of tremendous interest, and this interaction between fisheries and marine renewables around the world. Recordings of this presentation will be posted on TIFIS, and you'll see up on your slide there's the location there. Please watch for more Annex 4 and TIFIS announcements. And if you're not on our mailing list yet, what we call TIFIS Blast, which comes out every other week, please join up. And I do want to note for those on the call that Annex 4 will be hosting a workshop at the UTEC, European Wave and Tidal Energy Conference in Cork at the end of August. And it will be focused around social and economic issues associated with marine renewables. So watch out for that kind of announcement if you have an interest. With that, I want to wrap up. I want to thank Mike Bell and Kieran Riley very much for a really interesting webinar, and thank you all for joining us. And we're completed. Thank you.
And with that, again, we would like to thank all of our guests for joining us today on our conference. That does conclude our call at this time, and you may now disconnect.